Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. This is Writing for Instruction hosted by the ACRL Distance and Online Learning Section Discussion Group. My name is John Stowers. I'm a co-chair of the discussion group. And I think today's workshop is just going to be fantastic. I'm really excited for all of us to be here today. Before I hand it over to Heidi, I just want to share some thank yous. I want to thank my colleagues on the DOLS discussion group, co-chair Jen, former co-chair Barbara, and committee members Anna, Ashley, Brenda, Hope, and Tessa for all of their wonderful collaboration throughout the year and for this event. I'd like to thank Alois and Brian and others at ACRL for their help with this event. And finally, I'm just tremendously grateful for Heidi Burkhardt for sharing her expertise with us today. Heidi is the web project manager and content strategist at the University of Michigan Library. Much of Heidi's library experience has involved supporting library users across a variety of online platforms. And in fact, early in her career, she served as the distance learning librarian at Norwich University in Vermont. So kind of one of us DOLS people. Heidi also teaches the Library Juice Academy course, Writing for the Web. And before I turn it over to Heidi, I'd just like to give you a heads up that at the end of today's session, we'll be sharing a link in the chat to an evaluation form so that we could gather feedback on today, but also learn about different types of events and programming that you would like the discussion group to help promote for you and create. So with that, we'll turn it over to Heidi. So thank you, Heidi.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. Let me get all set up and do that thing where we hope this goes how we want it to go. Let's see. Almost out of steps. We're almost there. Full screen. All right. We good? Yes. Okay. So thank you again to John for that introduction and to the Distance and Online Learning section for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And welcome again to online Writing for Instruction materials. As the workshop description stated, sorry, I'm like moving my camera thing around the videos. As the workshop description said, I'm going to be covering the foundational principles and helpful guidelines that you can use anytime you're trying to explain how to do something in writing. Everything I'm presented today is rooted in writing for the web. And I think there's this inclination when you hear web writing or writing for the web that you automatically think web pages. But the strategies and best practices are useful for so many things. When I first started learning about it, I immediately shifted my approach to writing emails, for example. And there's lots of spaces where we're writing instructions. So that's the lens we're going to take today. So a little bit more about me. So again, I am Heidi. I use she, her pronouns. On the screen is a picture of me with my daughter, Sylvie. I have shoulder length brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a pink scarf, and I am reading a picture book. I believe it is Potato Pants, as a mystery reader at her school, which is a very delightful activity to take part in. So again, I'm the web project manager and content strategist at the University of Michigan Library. I've been here for going on 8 years this fall. And my kind of story and journey is that I was one of those English majors who loved writing and didn't know what to do with it. Ended up getting my master's in library and information science because I liked kind of lit review style research. I enjoyed finding articles and indexing databases and then hunting for them in the stacks in the print journals and making photocopies. So for some reason, I thought that was a good reason to get my master's, and I ended up as a librarian. I thought I wanted to be a reference and instruction librarian in an academic library. And as John said, I ended up getting a job as a distance learning librarian. So that was back in 2009-ish. So I will say to you all, like through these pandemic times when everybody was discovering online and distance learning, I saw you all, and I know that we have been doing this for a long time. So when they invited me to teach this, I really wanted to jump right on it. As a distance learning librarian is also when I first started getting interested in user experience and web writing, and I was using the lens of fostering libraries as a place for online students. Eventually, I took a writing for the web course through Library Juice Academy about a decade ago at this point, and that really solidified things for me. I ended up shifting into a head of digital services role and did more UX and web stuff. And then I left to come to Michigan in 2015 and am now in the role I'm in now for the past almost 5 years. So my big thing is that I led our website redesign, which launched in 2020. And now I do a lot of the day-to-day content management and lead our web content strategy. And as John said, I now teach that very writing for the web course. And I actually saw one of my current students in the participant list. So she's about to get some spoilers for next week's content. So before we get into the main content for today, I wanted to do a welcome question because this is a workshop, as much as it can be with almost 100 people here, which is awesome. Want to get your brains woken up a little bit. So we're going to be using the chat a lot today. I'm hoping it's a vibrant place. And the first question is a really good welcome question I like to use. And it's, if you had to give a 5-minute lightning talk with zero notice, what would it be about? So I'd love to see your responses in the chat. While you're thinking, oh, Zotero, I can't even pronounce that word, dogs, OER. So mine is how my efforts to perfect the Detroit style pizza at home. Oh my gosh, the 1999 cinematic classic, The Mummy. This is amazing. So Detroit style pizza at home. There's a lot going on here, you know, the type of pan that you use, the heat of the oven, you get the crispy edges around it. There's lots of cheese, Wisconsin brick cheese, very important. You put the sauce on top. So if you are into pizza and you've never had Detroit style pizza, I recommend looking into this. So I'm loving this. Maybe you all can make some friends in the chat and enjoyed this, hopefully not boring icebreaker question. All right, let me rearrange over here. So, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, yes. Okay, so what we're going to cover today, I have a lot for you. So we're going to talk about how people read on the web and considering your audience. We'll then get into structuring your writing, writing for humans, writing for readability and accessibility strategies, and then we'll get into a wrap up, a moment for a final reflection, and Q&A. I am packing in a lot, so I ask that you please save your questions until the end so we can make the most of our time together. And anything we can't get to, I'll welcome you reaching out to me outside of the workshop. So now that your brains are awake, from thinking about something fun that you're good at and love, I want you to take a moment to get in a space where you can think about how you're going to apply what we're learning today. So take a moment just to reflect on how often you write instructions and share in chat the kinds of writing that come to mind. How to use databases, reference questions, tutorials, writing libguides, texts, recipes. Yes. Library chat, reference questions, emails, training guides for student workers. Yes. How to access full text articles. Yeah, awesome. Process documentation, video scripts. Every single day is right. Constantly. Yes. All right, my people. Thank you. If you think of anything else, please keep going. Grocery list. So I told Jen and John, who are hosting this, that after this session, I have a decompressing trip to Target planned. I get a whole thing going with my list in the app. It's kind of gamified. Okay. Thank you. All right. So I can't just give you a whole bunch of strategies on writing for the web without giving you some foundational information on why this matters. In talking with the discussion group committee, we established that you all are likely coming into this with some knowledge already. So I'm going to cover the essentials to make sure we're all on the same level, but not go into a ton of depth. First, I'd like to start with basics from the research findings on how people read online. So the Nielsen-Norman group, which I'm sure many of you have probably heard of, NNG, has been studying how people read online for over 25 years, and not much has really changed. So they found that people are more likely to scan than read anything in full. On average, users read less than a third of words at most. They've found 28%. And they've done a bunch of eye tracking studies, and there's a lot of different gaze patterns. More have emerged as web design has shifted, but the F pattern is the most well-known. So with that, people scan horizontally left to right, and then vertically down the left-hand side of the page. So this means the first lines of text, as well as the first words on the left of each line, are most likely to be looked at. And then if you think about your search results in Google, how you have your results down one side, and then they have like the little knowledge card thing on the right, and just they're constantly kind of shifting how your how the little search snippets look. Those are designed to kind of make like your eye pinballs. So the pinball pattern is another one. I've linked to a few Nielsen-Norman group articles on these studies in the slides, which will be shared after, I believe, and I think Jen or someone else can put at least the first one in the chat. But I do want to note that anytime I'm talking about Nielsen-Norman group, like their work on how people read on the web is seminal, and they're considered foundational and authoritative resource. I will also trip over my words today, guaranteed. In the field of user experience, they are not without critique. I'm happy to share a few resources around that if folks are interested. Don Norman has said some not cool stuff. All right. So we know people aren't inclined to read in full on the web. They're likely trying to answer a question or complete a task. And since we're talking today about writing instructions, we need to think about how we can help people do those things, keeping in mind that folks may read or take in more or less, depending on the format. To write effective instructions, you need to think about the human beings on the other end. Who is your audience? Are you writing instructions for a colleague? I was doing that just this morning. Maybe a faculty member, a first-year undergraduate student who may or may not have had exposure to libraries in high school, a graduate student who you've worked with before. Put a face to these people if you can, and also consider where they might be coming from when they get to your writing. Are they feeling chill and eager to learn, like it's a beautiful day in the summer, like kind of low pressure? Are they stressed out? It's finals, they're on a deadline, possibly feeling confused, or maybe they're in a hurry. Maybe they think they already know what you're trying to tell them. There's a lot of possibilities, but try to kind of, I have put your empathy pants on, empathy pants, empathy hat. Maybe it's potato pants was coming back to me when I was writing my notes. So we're going to build on that first reflection on writing instructions and think about a specific scenario where you were recently writing instructions. Who was the audience for your instructions? And what do you think they were thinking or feeling coming to your content? And share that in the chat. This one's a little harder, huh? I believe in you. First and second years, how do I get this assignment done as quickly as I can? Overwhelmed, students feeling stressed, non-traditional students feeling overwhelmed by doing research again. Undergraduates, why does this matter to me? Students feeling confused. Yes. Now you're going. There we go. I can't even read them anymore. They're coming too fast. Student confused and overwhelmed. The librarians in the library, I was providing with a task to do, so I wanted to be clear on next steps. Excited and nervous for new student workers. Oh my gosh, reacquainted with APA style. Thankful, like I don't do a whole lot of publishing, but I have written a few articles lately with a co-author, and thank goodness that she's very good at these things, because I don't remember how to do citations anymore. Documentation for faculty. Why would I want this content in my LMS, and how do I get it there? Yes, so good. Thank you. Now that we have our foundations and how people read online, and we've thought a bit about our audience, you can start applying that structure to your writing. The inverted pyramid, which is comes out of journalism, is a framework where the most important content should be obvious and at the beginning. For writing instructions, this means putting your essential or primary message for people first. Think about what will matter the most to most of your readers, or the specific person you're writing instructions for. Put the less important content next, perhaps the things that only some people will need or that aren't as important, and then save the least important content for last. Or if it's something that you could share in a follow-up, if they really need it, you could cut it completely and save it for later. Concept. Another helpful strategy is to think about your content in chunks or concepts. Then when you get writing, only present one concept per paragraph. I find this very helpful for organizing my thoughts and content, and also for keeping my paragraphs tight. If you're a visual person, maybe you need a mind map of some kind. I tend to just jot things down, got my Post-its, which unfortunately I spilled water on earlier. I have my Post-its, put just a quick list, and then write. And then you want to use your organization intentionally to set expectations and guide your readers. Often we're writing instructions and telling people to do something. There's some sort of sequence to that, right? Maybe it's not completely linear, but organizing by sequence is likely a strong option. A more granular version of sequence would be explicit step-by-step instructions. But this, of course, would not work as well for things that are less straightforward. And if there are tasks, but it doesn't matter what order they happen in, you could think about organizing by those, like format. So search for articles, search for books, but it doesn't matter what order you do that in. It's just those chunks. And if you're writing instructions that apply to a variety of audiences, and the message might be a little bit different depending, by audience might be an option as well. If there isn't a natural delineation into sequence, task, or audience, you might want to think about the order people might ask questions. Frequently asked questions, if you will. But that is where I put out my warning, which is that while FAQs can be a great way to think through what you need to cover and what order to put it in, I really encourage thinking twice before structuring instructions as an FAQ. If questions are frequently asked, they should be answered already in a structure where people can find it. You can also end up with duplicate information, which makes maintenance harder. I've included a link to a post from GovUK in the slides, and Jen just put it in the chat, thank you, about why they don't use them. And they actually mentioned a 10-year-old tweet that said, an FAQ shows you've thought about what your users should know without thinking about your users. So something to consider. Depending on the kind of instructions you're writing and the format, it might be appropriate to consider layering or scaffolding your content. So presenting information at the point of need rather than sharing everything up front. This will help make sure that people don't get too overwhelmed with too much information at once. It also puts them in control, allowing different people to get the information that they want on a topic. The idea here is to guide people through a path to more information. They can stop on the path when they have the information they need. If you've already thought about instructions in chunks, it'll help you figure out what layers are needed. And with that, you can then try to extract the key messages or topics from the information you want to convey and use those highlights as your top layer. For some people, seeing the top layer of information is enough. Examples of this would be like a landing page on a website or a guide, where you provide a little bit of information and then you have to select in for more, or maybe conveying the most important information in an email or course management system page and then linking out to more details in a guide or a document. Next, we're going to talk about writing for humans. I asked you all to think about audience and the humans on the other side of your writing. And now we'll talk about tangible strategies to write for humans using a conversational style. Humans, I would argue, are better than robots. And I know at this point, I feel like I have to say something about ChatGPT, but where I'm at on that is knowing that it's an evolving thing and it'll probably impact me someday. But for now, I have my circles of control, influence, and concern, and it's like not even in there. It's like maybe edging into concern. So anyway, as you write web content, think about the person calling you on the phone or approaching you in person and asking you about a topic. And then respond authentically like in real life. So write like you talk. Good web writing sounds like a real person wrote it and that they are speaking directly to you. If you pay attention to web pages and how content is written, you'll notice that a lot of good web content is written in a more conversational style. It will use an active voice, which I'll discuss more in just a moment, and talks directly to the reader using pronouns. So it uses you to address the reader and we or us to talk about the organization, or I, if you were just writing directly to someone. A quick catch in writing for libraries is to avoid using the library or libraries unless it's absolutely necessary for clarity. So, replacing that with we or us instead of saying something like eligibility will be verified by the library, you can say we will verify your eligibility. That's also an example of switching from passive to active voice. You might even want to consider reading what you wrote out loud to see how it sounds. So I just mentioned using active voice, and this is one of the very best strategies for more conversational writing. It's also easier to read, and active voice allows you to address your reader directly and sound authentic. When you write using active voice, there's a clear subject, doing, and action. In passive sentences, it can be hard to even make out what the subject is. They are vague, hard to follow, and kind of a drag to read. So 2 examples for you here. One is library customers must sign into their library account to renew books, which is passive, and then sign into your library account to renew books is active. An even simpler example is the presentation was given by Heidi versus Heidi gave the presentation. So if you're reading a sentence and it just feels kind of gross while you're reading it, check to see if it's passive. With that, I want to take a moment to talk about voice and tone. While it might be tempting to use these terms interchangeably, and I have been guilty, voice and tone each have a distinct role. So we'll talk about voice first, and that's who you are. It reflects your personality and point of view. When done well, your voice can inspire trust and confidence among your readers and build relationships over time. Tone is the expression of your voice as best adapted for your audience. So an example is the difference between a job interview and meeting up with your friend. You're still you in both of those scenarios, but you're probably going to convey a very different tone in a job interview than you would if you're meeting up with your friend for breakfast, right? In my opinion, writing like a human is how you establish your voice, and adjusting your tone demonstrates that you're human too. Right. Our third participation is to think about your voice and how it sounds in writing. What do you try to embody? Or if you're thinking about what your voice sounds like in writing and are like, oh, I don't want to sound like that, think aspirationally, I should pick easier words for myself, about how you want to sound. So for me, I really aim for my voice to be kind and friendly, and I try to be confident by not hedging or apologizing too much. I'm trying. And then my tone shifts from more business speak. So if I'm saying I'm going to circle back or ping somebody, that's my business speak, to being kind of silly, if we're cool like that. And it all depends on my audience. So please share. Kind and helpful and authoritative, friendly and direct, friendly and open, welcoming, competent, helpful, friendly, helpful and competent, approachable. I like that, Jenny. Yes, lots of approachables. That's such a good one. Understanding, patient, kind, warm, and confident. Oh, you're all lovely, empathetic, relatable, clear, Yes, approachable, especially for follow-ups. That's a really good point. Just drink of water. Concise is hard, Melissa. I'm friends with Melissa. So clear and concise is hard. And we're going to get into some tips for that just now. All right. Now is all the stuffs. So the thing about writing for readability is that it also means your writing will be more accessible. These principles really go hand in hand, and I am going to run through all of my favorites with you today. The first few strategies that I have for you are ways to help your readers skim and scan to find the information they're looking for. These build off the considerations we went through earlier around structuring your content. Using lists in particular is a great way to make your content easier to scan. They're also important for accessibility because they give everyone a cue that the items are connected in some way. There are some things to keep in mind with lists. So a bulleted list or unordered works well for lists of related items or options. So where it doesn't necessarily matter what order they're presented in. Scanning the information in bullets is much easier than if this content were written out in one long compound sentence. They also add white space, which gives the content room to breathe and aids readability. So I have a screenshot here of a before and after that's on a page from plainlanguage.gov, and I don't at all expect you to be able to read this. I just want you to see the difference between the big wall of text on the left and the shorter introduction with a bulleted list on the right that say the exact same information. And Jen just put that in the chat as well if you'd like to look at it more closely. Then for numbered or ordered lists, those are great for steps in a process or instructions, but you should only use a numbered list if indicating a sequence, or I used them actually just this morning because it was something where there were 2 requirements and I actually labeled them as 1 and 2. It just made more sense in that context, but you don't want to insinuate an order or an order of operations if there isn't actually one. Right. Parallelism is a favorite. So that refers to parallel grammatical structure. Our brains are very pattern oriented, and creating a pattern makes it easier and faster for people to read and understand. So this is easiest to see when you compare and contrast. So I have 2 lists here for you using very generic library examples. So the first, how to get a library card. Complete an application. You must provide a photo ID and proof of permanent address. Above information should be presented to the librarian at the desk. Or complete a library card application, have a photo ID and proof of permanent address, bring the above to the librarian at the information desk. Which one of those is easier to read? 2. Thank you. Yes, 2. List number 2 on the right uses parallel grammatical structure. While the steps in list number 1 each read very differently, the list number 2 ones all start with a verb in the present tense and use a similar sentence structure. It's faster and easier to read because it uses parallel structure and creates a pattern. So as much as possible, you can use parallelism in lists, including numbered and bulleted lists. I'm trying to avoid saying the word lists over and over because it's really hard. You should try it later. Or menu items. You can use parallelism not only in lists, but also in headings and even individual sentences or between paragraphs. This is another space where I do want to give a caveat because I've seen people get into like, I've got to make this parallel. I have to make it parallel. And then you end up forcing it. It has to be a balance. So sometimes trying to keep things parallel, especially with menu items or headings, it can end up feeling like you tried too hard to make it parallel and you lose clarity. So as with everything, you have to consider the context of your content. And if it doesn't read well, don't force it. I thought about dropping tables from this, and then I changed my mind. So like lists, using tables can be helpful for creating white space and helps you skim. They're best when trying to organize related content, and especially if you're working with any sort of numbers or data. They also work well for if this, then that sorts of relationships. By using a table, you give your content additional structure to make it easier to understand. That said, tables should not be used solely for creating a layout. All things considered, I recommend using tables as a last resort and only when the content truly warrants it. I can count the number of pages with tables on our website on one hand. And while not related to writing instructions, the example that I have here is from the statistical highlights page on our website, and it's very illustrative of something that would not work well in a paragraph or a bulleted list. It needs to be a table. It has a list of services down one side and then numbers in 2 columns. And you don't want to use tables for a layout because a table insinuates structure, especially for somebody who's using a screen reader, and you don't want to indicate that there is structure when there actually isn't any, and you're just doing it to try to make it look pretty. All right, so making things concise. We have a number of strategies for this, and I hope these are things you're able to put into practice right away. As you're writing, give people only what they need and cut what's not necessary. So this is one of the key skills for writing effectively online. And when you first start out with cutting words, it's really hard. Writing an active voice definitely helps. And there's some other specific things you can look for to help ease into this. So number 1 is meaningless modifiers, often found at the beginning of sentences. So throw away your please notes, your keep in minds, you will find, and even the word that, I think can almost always be cut. There's sometimes with writing, you'll just say that, and you don't actually need it. And most of the time, removing these from your sentences won't detract from the meaning. You can also eliminate redundant instructions, which is kind of hilarious since this session is about writing instructions, but web content often includes unnecessary instructions, and we should strive for things to be self-explanatory. Forms are where you'll find the most guilt here. So a form that has, please fill out the form below at the top, or complete questions to the best of your ability, or be sure to complete all required questions. The form itself should be obvious for those things. And then we have to watch out for too many adverbs, very helpfully, unfortunately, really, or weakening words and phrases like maybe, perhaps, or just. I'm guilty of both of these. You can't take all my adverbs away. They're not inherently bad, but too many can make your writing harder to read. So overall, try to keep revising and cutting a little bit more each time. So Steve Krug, a usability pioneer who wrote Don't Make Me Think, encourages us to get rid of half the words on the page and then get rid of half of what's left, which is a bit unrealistic, I'd say, but it just emphasizes that there's pretty much always something you can cut. Go for short and simple. So cutting unnecessary text helps you keep your writing short and simple. Other techniques include keeping your paragraphs and sentences short. So you can avoid that big old wall of text by using shorter paragraphs. And I saw somebody asked earlier about how short, so I'm going to answer you now. If you thought about your content in chunks, like we talked about before, you're already on your way. On the web, it's also completely fine to have a 1-sentence paragraph, believe it or not. You'll start seeing it more places once you start looking for it. And I really like using them sometimes. If you like specific guidelines, Anne Handley wrote a book called Everybody Writes, and in that she advocates for no more than 3 sentences per paragraph. I think you can be flexible with this if the sentences are very short. I personally pay more attention to how many lines it ends up being. If your paragraph goes more than 6 lines on a full-size monitor, try cutting or splitting it up. And I tend to err more towards like 4, but it really depends on the line length of what you're writing and the context you're writing in. You also want to keep your sentences short. Long sentences get pretty hard to read. Anne's rule for this is under 25 words. I used to think that was easier said than done, but I've been practicing and it's really not that bad. See, really. And I think you can do it with practice. And finally, look for spots where you can use a simpler word. Utilize is the one that gets me. You can almost always say use instead. And there's a great list of simpler alternatives to common words that plainlanguage.gov put together. And I'll share that in the wrap up. I cannot skip talking about link labels with you all. This is one of my long crusades. If you're writing instructions, odds are you'll be linking to things. It's important to provide clear and concise link labels to lead your users to the content that they're seeking, and to also make sure that your links look like they are links. People should be able to understand from the words in your label what they will get when they select the link. Make your labels meaningful and unambiguous. Before even selecting it, people should have a good idea of where they're going to land. This is important for everyone, but it's crucial for visually impaired people who navigate your website or your instructions wherever they are with a screen reader and may ask it to skip through the text and read the links on the page. Effective use of links makes your content more accessible. Specifically, phrases such as click here, more, or click for details, or even just here by itself are meaningless when read out of context. Using click here tells you nothing about where you're going to go or what you're going to get when you select it. One easy way to write effective link labels is to match the link label with the page title for where it takes them, or at least really close to it. So I threw in a quick example, and when you get the slides, don't click on these because I realized that they're authenticated links, but I didn't feel like coming up with another example. They go into Iliad. So the first one is click here to set your departmental delivery preference, or be sure to set your departmental delivery preference. And the first one, click here is the link. So if you had a screen reader, it would say, I'm a bad screen reader, but link, click here, link to set your departmental delivery preference, where be sure to set your link departmental delivery preference link, you know exactly where you're going to go. You'll also notice I've styled them slightly differently. Underlining is the long-standing convention for link styling. You can also use a different color as it makes the link stand out, but you should not rely on color alone. For accessibility, you never want to rely on just color to convey meaning. An indicator that you're on a link should also appear on mouse hover and keyboard focus, and be careful not to rely on hover for someone to realize it's a link. It makes it hard to notice, but remember, in a world of touch screens, hover does not exist. And now we head into strategies around formatting. We'll start with building off of link labels and styling. You don't want to make things look like links that are not. This is one of my biggest peeves. This can happen if you underline something, which I never recommend using unless it's a link, or try to use color to indicate meaning and have it come across as a link. I've seen this particularly so that like tealish blue I had in the last slide is a very common link color. And I was on a site recently that was using that for the headings, and it made me want to click every heading. We've also taken underlining out of the editor on our website because links are underlined automatically, and we don't want people underlining anything else. Alternatives are to use headings to provide structure, or use bold when you want to draw attention to something. And I know, at least for me, underlining, bold, and italics are all together in my mind. So now I'll talk about italics, especially in big sections of text. Italics make things much more difficult to read. So I recommend only italicizing 1 or 2 words, or using it for a very consistent purpose. So like we always italicize the byline on news items. But generally, if you're thinking about, man, I really want to put this whole paragraph in italics, why? But also, is it something where you could use bold for more emphasis? And keep in mind that when used a lot, techniques like using bold to bring emphasis can end up losing meaning too. So if you find that you're wanting to emphasize a lot of points, take a step back and consider whether you should organize that content differently, either through headings or layering. All caps is still yelling. It's been yelling since AOL Instant Messenger and before times, and it still is. It's also hard to read, similar to italics, and this is because all of the letters are the same height, so they blend together. You also want to make sure that your use of capitalization is intentional and has meaning. So don't do things like capitalize nouns for no particular reason. This avoids potential confusion, like why is this capitalized? Is it very important? And also improves readability. So sentence case, where only the first letter of the word and proper nouns are capitalized, is easier to read than title case, where every significant word is capitalized. The ups and downs of the letters in title case make your eyes zigzag up and down. So I recommend sentence case as much as possible, but also make sure to be strategic about which one you're using where. So we use title case on our website for page titles, but sentence case everywhere else, including for headings. The most readable text is left justified, rag right, and that's typically going to be the default. I can't say I've ever seen something default to anything else. That's in contrast to justified text, which causes obvious inconsistency and spacing between words, much harder to follow and can cause eye strain. I don't know if people still use justified text, but I'm keeping it here just in case. But I do know that people use center text, and center text is problematic for a similar reason as title case. As our eyes go to the next line of content on a page, you want it to be where you expect it at the start, right? So by having each line start at a different place, our eyes end up zigzagging all over the place. It's troublesome for paragraphs of text, but even in this example, that's only a few lines, you can tell readability suffers. Another thing to pay attention to is your color contrast, especially if you're working in something like LibGuides where you have control over changing those things. It's especially important for people with visual impairments, but poor contrast between font colors and their background can impact everyone, especially since colors and shades vary between displays. You don't want to rely on your own eyes or what you think looks good. Many things that might seem like they'll pass and are adequate or not. Yes, PowerPoint, sorry. Instead of obvious examples, I wanted to include some that are a little bit more subtle here. So the ones on the top are kind of a reddish orange against the light background. The one on the left fails. The very slightly darker one on the right passes. And then underneath, I showed a darker kind of tealish blue with white text. And I had to go a little bit further down kind of the shade gradient to get to one that would pass here. There are lots of free color contrast checkers out there, and I have my favorite one for you in the wrap-up list. While we're discussing formatting choices that very specifically impact accessibility, I want to emphasize the importance of using semantic headings. We've already talked about how to use headings to break apart your content, but when we talk about headings, it's not just about bolding or formatting text to look like a heading. I just cleaned up a document for somebody who had done this. You need actual semantic headings using heading tags in your web content and your documents, such as a heading 1 or an H1 for heading 1, H2 for heading 2. This is important, especially for folks navigating with screen readers, but the clear structure benefits everyone. It's also what allows you to build up a little table of contents in Google Docs. On the web, the page title is often the heading 1, so it's not unusual for the heading 2 to be the first one you use in body content on a page. You should never skip headings in order or use them strictly for formatting. We actually removed the heading 1 from our editor on our website because it's always used for the page title. So sometimes you can stop people from doing things that are bad for them, sometimes. And since I know instructions can mean images, I wanted to be sure to talk about alternative text or alt text. Alt text provides a textual equivalent to audio and visual content. It's inclusive of folks who can't access the original, whether because of ability, environment, or technology. It also provides semantic meaning, and descriptions to images can be read by search engines if that's relevant. Alt text should be accurate, equivalent, and succinct. If you're writing instructions online and providing screenshots, for example, you should provide alt text that approximates the purpose of the image in context. It's not just about describing what the image is. The best first step to writing alt text is asking yourself, what is this image doing here? Knowing this will help you establish what you are trying to convey through the image that the user needs to know. And remember that some people will only see or hear your alt text. I am by no means not an expert on this at all. I've been writing alt text for a long time, and I've been fortunate to work with some folks who are very, very good at it. But I have a very good article from WebAIM for you all in my wrap-up list that lays things out really nicely. So now I'm going to breathe, and we're going to move into the wrap-up. And I'm even a few minutes ahead on time here. While I take a sip of water. So, favorite tools and resources. These are the things that I use regularly. And Jen just put all these in the chat for you. The Hemingway app is one of my go-tos. It's a web application in your browser where you can copy and paste whatever text you're working on, and it highlights things that are easier, things that are sort of hard to read or really hard to read. It identifies passive voice. It identifies all of your adverbs. And generally, it just kind of helps me trim down when I'm feeling stuck. I'll often just like take a couple sentences out of a document and pop it into that to work on something without distraction. My favorite color contrast checker is the one from WebAIM. That's the one I pull up all the time. You pop in your hex code for your foreground and your background colors and see if they pass. The plainlanguage.gov simpler word list is the one that I mentioned. It's this very magical table where they have all these words that are too complicated and then the simpler version. The WebAIM article on alt text that I mentioned does a really nice job of kind of laying out the nuances of writing alt text and has examples in it that I find very helpful. There is some stuff later in it that gets a bit more technical that you can probably skip, but it's the best overview that I've found. I looked for an alternative at some point and there was not one. I am selfishly touting our new Library design system, which we launched back in February, and it has all of our content guidance built into it. Really proud of that, and has kind of how we approach writing in the library. And then the diversity style guide is my go-to for when I need to educate myself and make sure that I am using the best choices of words that I can. Now I have a final reflection, because this is still a workshop. How are you going to use what we learned today soon? And share in chat if you like, and then we will go into Q&A. Reference emails, writing more succinctly, LibGuides, adding alt text to LibGuides, yay. These darn LibGuides, I tell you. Woo, procedure documents. Audit. Yes. Keep thinking. I'm going to give people another few seconds before we open up Q&A, because then I'm worried chat's going to get wild. Right. So at this point, we have 10 minutes left for questions. So that's awesome. You can keep final reflections rolling in, and John and Jen will keep an eye out for questions. I also have them up here too. I saw a couple and I know I answered at least one. Any link tips for places we can only use plain text? I think the best thing would be, because putting the full HTTP URL is not great, right? Because then a screen reader is going to read the whole thing. So if you have access to a link shortener, or you can just use bit.ly to at least make the link shorter. Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie, for popping those in. And then another question John pulled from above, I did notice this one from Martha. What if the FAQs are taken from real user questions? That's great that you know what questions your people are asking. So I would say you don't know that everybody is going to think of that question, but you can provide the answers to people in a structure and format that'll make sense for as many people as possible. So I think consider the fact that you know their questions as a gift and figure out how you can best make it readable and understandable for everybody. James asked, you mentioned not skipping heading levels or using headings for formatting that I didn't quite follow. Could you expand on that? Sure, I would love to. So if you have, say you're formatting a page in a guide and you want to make the text a little bit bigger. So you make it a heading 3, and then somebody's using a screen reader and they come to that and the title of the guide is a heading 1, and then they're, tabbing through, and then it's a heading 3 all of a sudden, and they might wonder where the heading 2 is. So they're trying to figure out the structure of your page when they can't see it. And by skipping the heading 2, they might think that they're missing something. So you just always want to follow that hierarchy, that a heading 3 only comes after a heading 2. And if the styles in your guides are making it that those things are not working well, then I think you need to work with people to change the style in your guides. For docs, where you have a title header and a heading level 1 header, do you recommend starting with title or starting with heading 1? That's a great question, Brittany. I tend to I use the title and then I start with a heading 1. But I definitely know folks who do the opposite and do a heading 1 and then only do heading 2s in the doc. That is something where I am not as much, I don't have quite as much knowledge, but I think either way is better than none at all. You're welcome. Martha asked, will the slide deck accompany the recording when sent to participants? John is nodding yes. I gave the A-OK to share my slides. Jen, you had so many great tips. Do you use some sort of checklist to make sure you incorporate everything while you're writing? No, I do not. I do it a lot. So there's things that I know I look for. A lot of it has just been kind of ingrained in me, but lest you think that I just write beautifully all the time. I have this great example where I was just working with somebody on some new web content the last couple of days. And they gave me, it was like a CFP, a call for proposals or applications, and I reworked it as a web page, but I totally missed the boat on making it conversational. So my colleague Mary was like, I'm changing every time this uses the word fellow to you, your. I was like, oh, thanks. So sometimes another human is helpful if you have access to them. I'm sure there's checklists out there. I feel like I saw one really recently. The US design system that the digital service made, I feel like they might have had one, but I'd have to dig for it. Chat. Perhaps I stunned them with too much information. If you could offer one piece of advice about creating LibGuides, what would you suggest? We are in the process of redoing ours to make them more user-friendly. Oh gosh, I don't know if you all really want to know how I feel about LibGuides. Start over. So look at what you have and think about how you would do it if you were making it from scratch. Seriously, I think that is my best advice. Do you have any tips for proposing edits to other people's writing on web pages or library guides? So I have found, kindness, right? But also showing how, and like a before and after example. of like, this is what this, like, this is, here's something else. So like the thing I was just working with somebody on, I had a feeling they might be hesitant to let us like totally rework it. So I showed like, here's something that we created for a very similar type of content need, and like, take a look at that. And they were totally like cool with us relooking at it and suggesting edits. So that's, modeling and showing how you can be helpful. A grammar punctuation course you recommend, from Stephanie. Like I said, I was an English major, and my favorite course was a grammar class that only the people that were in like the teaching track took, but I loved it, like diagramming sentences and everything. So Jenny, who I know is the copy editor for Weave, so she knows what she's doing, recommend Benjamin Dreyer's book, Dreyer's English. Yeah, I'm sorry that I don't have a grammar recommendation. Caitlin, start from scratch. We did our whole website from scratch. It was mostly a technical decision, but we did not migrate anything. What advice would you have for a colleague who struggles with writing instructions for processes, student workers to complete tasks? They have a hard time knowing how to get started and how to translate their task to words or screenshots. Are there articles or books out there to help? That's a really good question. So I guess I would say, like, for that person, how do they best process information? Like, are they somebody who likes to write it all out? Do they like to kind of go through things, like actually physically go through the process? Do they want to draw? Do they need to sketch it out? And maybe then see if that helps them figure out how to start writing it for somebody else. I can't say, I mean, there's tons of books about how to write, but I did not prepare myself with recommendations for books. I apologize. Doing it from scratch. 258. Any tips for writing content for people who have English as a second or additional language? So this is something that I should really learn more about, but I think that when you are considering writing in plain language, like plain language is going to benefit everyone because it is simpler. And then in terms of writing for people who use English as a second language, because we have a very complicated language, that will be better for them as well. So
Okay,
I see
Heidi.
it's 2:59.
Yeah,
Yep.
2:59. So
Going to
thank
go
you.
to my next slide as a thank you. And my email is heidisb@umich.edu if you want to come and find me.
That was absolutely fantastic, Heidi. Thank you so much for all those great tips, all the evidence-based guidance you've given us, accessibility tips as well for writing. I think all of us are going to look at our writing more carefully than we have in the past, thanks to your wonderful workshop today. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to go really quickly and put a link in the chat, and that is for feedback for today, but also we'd love to hear any suggestions that you have for future discussion group events. And as Lois mentioned before, shortly, as soon as the recording is available, we will share both the recording to the session and the slides from Heidi's presentation. So thank you so much, Heidi. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you'll take part in future Joel's discussion group events as well.